Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And as you can gather, we're currently in the countdown phase to the start of a brand new classic racing season, which for me will begin in about 3 or 4 weeks' time when we head off to the Scottish Classic Round 1 event at Finhaven in Forfar in just a few weeks' time. And soon after that, we'll be able to bring you more of the old classics and of course, the racing from that particular event. But we're going to continue now with our look at the big bore two-strokers. And next up, it's a turn of Bryan Woods' lovely CR500R Honda. So let's jump straight into that video and take a look. Right, and so this featured big bore rocket ship is Bryan Woods' 1989 CR500 Honda Evolution bike, which Bryan doesn't actually ride himself, but he does do all of the preparation work on the bike, and then he sponsors other riders to put the machine through its paces. So as you can imagine, if you were a keen and talented big bore motocross racer and Bryan was to hand you this little beauty here and tell you to thrash it on the track, then you'd probably think that all your Christmases had come early. But then again, and as in our previous big KX500 that we featured recently, it's not everybody who can handle the power of these big open class Evolution Hondas, and its baby brother, the CR250, is more or less an everyman's bike, but these bigger 500s are a completely different animal altogether. But back in the 1980s and early 90s, it seemed that it was a bit of a battle royal between the big four of Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki and Yamaha, just to see who could build the biggest, baddest and fastest open class two-stroke Evolution bike on the planet. Now, Suzuki had their RM500, Kawasaki had their KX500, while Yamaha naturally had their YZ490. And of course, Honda had this super quick CR500, which many riders still claim was the best of the open class racers of that decade, because this bike here had it all, because it had a fantastic agile chassis with superb suspension on the front and at the rear, and of course that super smooth, mega powerful liquid cooled Honda engine that had a power curve that appeared to just be absolutely endless in its delivery. And if you believe all of the specs, it seemed that this big bore Honda was the perfect open class racer. But nevertheless, it's not everybody who can take a 230-pound dirt bike with about 65 horsepower on tap and then ride it to its 100% capacity, of which many riders do claim they can, but in reality it's only a small handful who actually have the necessary skills, which is again why these bigger capacity bikes never sold in the same numbers that their smaller 250s did. Mainly, of course, because these big bore Hondas were much more expensive to buy in the first place, and because most club weekend racers just couldn't make the best use of its power when taking to the track. And more or less all of the big bore 500s suffered from exactly the same affliction, with far too much power and not enough qualified pilots to fly them. So let's get into our Bryan Wood Honda and take a look at some of its parts, beginning of course with the chassis or the frame, which as you can see was still a tubular steel setup for 1989, and this chassis was certainly strong and relatively light for a steel frame, which they say was heavily strengthened down at the swing arm pivot and up here at the steering head, which were a couple of the more vulnerable parts of a motocross racer, especially if you were one of those riders who liked his airtime and the bike would land from a great height. But overall, our CR500 chassis was almost perfect in every respect, very strong and agile with very little or next to no flex whatsoever. So when it came to slotting in an engine to power our big 500, Honda had certainly engineered themselves a piece of motorcycle perfection with this liquid-cooled two-stroke powerhouse, which, as I remember, I think had a bore of 89 millimeters and a stroke of 79 millimeters. Now, to feed the fuel that it required, it was a 38 millimeter flat slide key-in carburetor that pumped the pre-mixed fuel into the barrel through a multi-pedal reed valve block. And here on the air filter side of the engine, it was a standard foam type filter that you could quite easily remove, wash and then re-oil before replacing it back into the plastic airbox. And according to that graphic there stamped on the outside, it's a quality twin air that Bryan's used on his 500. And again, on the spark side of our Evolution Honda, it's no surprise that it was an electronic CDI ignition system that supplied the ignition source to light up that big 500 power plant. And again, because this was a Honda engineered component, it was ultra reliable and virtually trouble-free. But staying here on this left-hand side of the engine, it was a 5-speed gearbox that made our red rocket fly along, and 5 speeds was more than enough cogs for your average rider, with probably most of them never even clicking this engine up into top gear, with the fear, of course, that the bike would simply take off into the stratosphere. But our 500 was still quite manageable using a steady throttle hand and being a bit more conservative with that gear shifting. Now, to help connect the motor and the transmission together with flawless precision, as you'd expect, it was a heavy-duty, wet multi-plate clutch that had the job of making those gear changes smooth and positive. But overall, the big Honda's clutch and gearbox and other engine components were really quite well engineered and worked extremely well together, which is nothing less than you'd expect from a motorcycle manufacturer such as Honda. Now, the exhaust expansion chamber here on Bryan's Honda isn't, of course, the original pipe, which is more or less what you'd expect on a 35-year-old dirt bike, but this DEP or Derek Elwell pipe is probably of much better quality than the one that Honda fitted at the factory in '89. And just to try and help protect the more vulnerable parts of the pipe from stones and other crud from the racetrack, Bryan's added this carbon fibre pipe guard, which should go a long way to minimise the usual damage that normally occurs on these kind of two-stroke expansion chamber exhaust pipes. And again, just to complement that expansion chamber, it also led on to this very nice DEP alloy tailpipe here at the back of the bike, which would have been quite similar to Honda's original in '89, but I've certainly had these DEP exhaust systems on a couple of my own dirt bikes in the past, and I've always found them to be very well made and good quality, so I can certainly see why Bryan's chosen these as replacements on his bike. But certainly in terms of its power and its delivery, these CR500 engines had masses of grunt and They could pull like the proverbial train from a way down in the rev range, and appeared to just have a power band that would just keep going and going as long as you were prepared to hold that throttle wide open, which wasn't that easy unless you were brave enough to give it a try. But in terms of its power and its delivery, these CR500 engines had masses of grunt, and they could certainly pull like the proverbial train from a way down in the rev range, and they just appeared to have a power band that would just keep going and going as long as you were quite happy to hold that throttle wide open, which wasn't that easy unless you were brave enough to give it a try. But generally, these Honda engines will only go as fast as you want them to go, but they certainly didn't take too kindly to being nursed along in high gears with low revs, because these engines just thrived on power and absolutely loved to be ridden hard and fast. And the more that you did it, the better these engines liked it. So as with all of the other big open class two-strokers, only the very brave and skillful will manage to tame these awesome machines. So when it came to getting one of these big bore engines fired into life, now it wasn't as easy as just firing up a smaller 125 or 250, and traditionally most of the big four manufacturers who made open class racers had much the same trouble when it came to kicking these big engines into life. But Honda had certainly made a couple of improvements on this 89 engine to try and alleviate that problem. And the first one was to increase the length of the alloy kickstart lever, which now folded away a lot better and doesn't hit that foot peg on its downward stroke. But the other starting assist was that Honda also added a couple of shallow grooves inside the cylinder bore, which were about half an inch long, just above the exhaust port, to bleed off some of that high compression at kicking speeds. And because the grooves were so shallow, they had very little effect on the motor when it was running at racing speeds. But the combination of the long kickstart and the cylinder modification meant that quite often it was easy enough to start this big Honda even sitting across the seat. Now, to keep that 500 CR engine reasonably cool during running, the bike had two small vertical radiators that were bolted onto either side of the chassis front down tube. And these plastic air scoops that you see here had the job of directing that oncoming air into the radiators, just to try and help reduce the temperature of the engine's coolant. And obviously to supply all of the motor's liquid coolant around the engine, it was this little gear-driven water pump here on the right-hand side that pumped all of that coolant to where it was required. So as we move on to our big Honda's front suspension, which were a pair of 45mm Showa upside down units, which as I remember, I think had about 12 inches of travel and 22 different adjustments that you could make to its rebound and damping parameters. But again, even straight from the factory, these Honda forks were more than adequate for this big 500, and many riders did comment at the time that these Showas hardly ever bottomed out, unless of course you were one of those guys who dropped it on its front end from a great height. But these Showas were almost trouble-free, and they never ever flexed or twisted, and most of the time the bike tracked straight and true into whichever direction you pointed it. Now, also for 1989, it would have been a Showa single piggyback shock that would have been fixed to our Honda's rear end in that year. But again, Bryan's gone a bit more upmarket again and replaced that stock Showa item with this Swedish top-of-the-range Öhlins shock, which will almost certainly be an upgrade on the Honda original, and it will also have much more scope for tuning and for making other kinds of adjustment. But again, you can see that rear Öhlins suspension shock is connected by way of a linkage system onto Honda's superb Pro Link rear swing arm, which was more or less the self-same part that was fitted onto the earlier 1988 CR Honda. But again, straight from the factory, the combined rear suspension shock and this Pro Link alloy swing arm performed perfectly, although if you were really fussy, there was still enough room to fine-tune that shock to suit your own kind of riding style and personal requirements. Now, the rear braking power on our Open Class Evolution Honda was supplied through a single pot sliding hydraulic caliper, which pressed its braking force onto an 8-inch steel disc. But even for just a single piston caliper, this rear brake still had enough stopping power to slow or even lock up this rear wheel whenever it was required. And here on the front, although it's not that visible in this shot, was a twin piston caliper, which naturally had much more stopping power than that back brake. But to protect the disc and the caliper from any kind of damage and other debris from the track, Bryan's also added this plastic brake guard just to prevent any such incidents taking place on these very critical items. So the big CR500 plastic fuel cell, I think, held almost 2.5 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, and although our particular CR500 motor certainly did like a drink, this fuel tank was still more than big enough to see it through the longest of races. And for comfort in the pilot's seat, it was one of those highboy type seats that crept up at the rear of the fuel tank. Now, this naturally was done so that the rider could use his or even her weight to shift from the back onto the front, just to try and balance the bike going in to the corners. But for a big Open Class 500, these Hondas only tipped the scales at around the 247 pounds mark, and that was with a full tank of fuel. But that certainly didn't make them any the less agile, because they were still easy enough to throw around. Now, as we move on to the Evo Honda's controls in its cockpit, this is where the CR500's pilot had to have his wits about him to make sure that this particular fighter jet didn't take to the skies. But it was a pair of Renthal twin wall handlebars here with modern style grips, which are of course wired onto the bars to stop the grips from slipping. But another quite important fitting to the bars is that black engine kill switch on the left there, which could quite easily be a bit of a lifesaver on a bike such as this, if it should one day get out of control and decide to take it to the skies. But one long press on this button should pretty soon calm it down. But certainly this is the speed controller responsible for much of the 65 or so horses that are waiting to be unleashed by the Honda two-stroke engine. So a quite steady hand is required when you turn this tap to the full-on position, because normally when you give this CR500 its head, it'll gallop past almost everything on the track. But back in 1989, if you lived in the USA, you could be expected to pay over $4,000 for one of these big bore 500 Hondas, which even by 1989 standards, it was still a quite big chunk of money for its day. But having said that, for your hard-earned dollars, you were certainly getting a whole lot of bike for your cash, and certainly something that was very competitive the minute it came straight from the sale room. But there was just one final little bit of trivia on these 89 CR500s that we haven't mentioned, and that was that in 1989 Honda also reduced the amount of spokes that were fitted onto this rear wheel from 36 down to 32, and it ended up saving the bike a full pound in weight, although they say that the reduced spoking never really had any detrimental effect on the strength of this back wheel. Anyhow, despite that little piece of micro information there regarding that back wheel, in 1989 Honda more or less had almost manufactured the perfect big bore motocross race bike, because this machine here certainly had a good strong steel chassis that even although it was made of tubular steel, it was still relatively light, and it still made the bike very flickable. But the stock standard Showa suspension also was excellent, with that rear connected onto Honda's magical Pro Link rear swing arm. But the star of the 1989 CR500 was, of course, that two-stroke engine that was almost unbreakable, and it had grunt and power in absolute bucket loads, and some would say it was just far too much power for your average weekend racer. And here we have a picture of the bike's owner, Bryan Wood, having his photo taken with another racing legend, the great Mark Fulton, when they were both pictured at Farleigh Castle just a few years back. And Mark also rides one of Bryan's CR500 Honda twin shockers, and here you can see Mark again pictured beside one-time Evolution British champion Scotsman Gavin Robertson. And again, these pictures were taken at a pre-season promotional photo shoot some years ago. But certainly at the end of the day, as 1989 Honda CR500s go, this particular bike here of Bryan's is a cracking example of one of these Honda flying machines. But Bryan's, of course, isn't a fully stock bike, but then again, very few of these 89 500s are nowadays, and you'd be quite hard-pressed to come across a stock standard example. And Bryan's bike here is probably just about as close as you're ever going to get to actually seeing one in the flesh. Okay, so coming up next on CDB TV, we're going to go back to the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show to check out another cracking bike from Steve Coughlin. And when we come back, we'll be taking a look at Steve's 1979 400 Myco, which is another bike that he just recently restored. So that's all coming up in my next video posting. But for the time being, thanks once again for taking the time to watch my channel, and until the next time, it's goodbye for now.